And it's the sequel to New Deal or Raw Deal. And it was really exciting writing it with Anita. In some ways, it was a test of our marriage when we would criticize each other's chapters. How many of you know husbands and wives? But I think we came through it rather well. And even though Anita came up with my tax chapter was my precious chapter, and Anita said, I think you need to eliminate, she did it nicely, the first 3,000 words in each chapter. And then we're sending about 12 million people overseas. And then we have zero unemployment. We haven't solved unemployment. We're now paying people to carry guns and shoot at people and get themselves killed. That's no way out of a depression. What happens after the war is good. Roosevelt, after he dies, the Republicans and Democrats in Congress cut the income tax down from the 94% level, and they cut the corporate tax from 90% at the top level to 37%. When they cut the corporate tax from 90 to 37%, businessmen said, now at last, for the first time in 13 or 14 years, we have an environment where we can compete and invest. And then we get television, the Xerox machine, McDonald's, and all of those good things coming in after we cut the tax rates. I think this supports the theory of the 20s and the 80s, and we can add to it the 40s. We finally get out of the Great Depression with the tax cuts. We've got that coming out in the fall. I think it's important for times like this, we need to look at history, how it functioned, and how it helps us to understand the present and to make better decisions in the present. Thank you for that question.
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
But I also realize that sometimes you can't admire some politicians you've liked for many years. What's your opinion of Newt Gingrich coming out strongly for subsidies for ethanol, which he just did the last few days? This really disappointed me.
Remember President Reagan's rule, never speak ill of another Republican?
In this case.
I'm going to invoke the Reagan rule and say that I was almost in tears when I saw what he had done. And then I knew I would have to invoke the Reagan rule to avoid commenting on it, because I just don't think it's a good idea to promote subsidies for ethanol. That's all.
He took himself out of the presidential race.
By the way, how many of you follow the Oakland Raiders? Did you know Hillsdale has a Jared Valdier as a tackle on the Oakland Raiders? His Hillsdale grad is on the all-rookie pro team, played for Hillsdale. So we do things other than study at Hillsdale. Most of our classes are only about 20 students or less. You know, we get to know each other. I know them, they know me. And sometimes they do exciting things like they go out and achieve wonderful things. Every time I'm in Washington, I run into one of my students, it seems, who's out there saying, I want to change the world, I want to change the world. And I'm so excited because that college, even though we only graduate about 300 students a year, is changing the world.
What do you think about the regressive regulations that are on the horizon concerning cap and trade, global warming, and all the other myriad of things that Barack Obama has in plan for us?
Well, I think they were planned, but I think as of November 2010, they're off the planning board and they're done.
Well, I'm not sure they've been dumped. They may have been temporarily tabled, so yeah. I would like to caution people about that.
I think that's a fair comment. They've been tabled. See, I'm so optimistic. Well, let me tell you why I'm optimistic. I am. When we have a parallel, right, with Roosevelt and Obama. It took American voters 6 years before they knocked Roosevelt in a midterm election, and he lost 81 seats, the biggest defeat of any incumbent president since last November. It took us 2 years. A Tea Party is in there. Ideas are in focus. There was very little effective opposition to Franklin Roosevelt during the entire 1930s. There was instant opposition to Barack Obama. And I think that it's exciting that the ideas that you stand for in this club and ideas that we teach at Hillsdale College, that we teach in the class. We have a required course in American history and world civilization, and they read original reading Martin Luther, they're reading the Bible. They're reading, on the American side, they start John Winthrop, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. They're reading in the original, and then they go out and are able to quote what the presidents and what the major thinkers of the day said, instead of what some historian says that they said, and they are prepared. We didn't have this kind of preparation in the 1930s. The tea parties, even a school like Hillsdale College, we just didn't have that going on. We do have it now. We have a lot of concerned citizens, and it's made a difference right away in a major election. Go ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I know that we have a number of wonderful young conservatives here and throughout the country, and short of matriculating every single young person in the country in Hillsdale, how do we bridge the gap between the young, competitive, on fire, future of our country with the kids who think that government is Santa Claus and should take care of their every possible need and that they should for the rest of their lives? How do we get this to meet?
That's a good question. I realize, that was funny, we can't send every kid to Hillsdale. And if you look at the weather patterns now, there isn't a kid in San Jose who want to go there right now. But that is true. I think you have to do it through the books and the literature that we have. And I think through Fox News, some of the TV shows that we have now. I think that we have a lot more available now that we didn't have in the 1930s, which is one of the reasons we're having more success now. I would start students out. I was talking with Susan Miller about this. I would start a student, have them read Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. You can't send them to Hillsdale College. I use that book in my class. That book is a brilliantly written book. It sold 1 million copies. It teaches the essence of economics, and it can be read by someone who has no basic understanding of economics to begin with. There are a lot of basic books that we can use like that can help students get on the right path, and at least raise the right questions so they're asking the right questions to their teachers in class. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. What are your thoughts on whether or not the debt ceiling should be increased?
I think that this is a political issue too. And as long as, if we have to increase it, and we're probably going to, if we can get a trade-off, and I'd say this is the same advice I would suggest perhaps to California. Governor Brown is wanting this huge package of tax increases. It sounds just absolutely awful. It's just grisly to read. It makes me want to get back to the blizzard. I was reading about that, and I thought, well, I guess what you have to do is stand firm and say, we won't sign on to anything unless we have an agreement to these cuts in spending. And so if you get an agreement, we will give you this, if you will give us this, and we can get some cuts in place, it might be a trade-off that will work to our advantage in the long run. It's a political decision, though. This is why you need not only people who are able to come up with good ideas, but people who have the political skill to figure out how to do the horse trading to get as much of that good idea into place. Go ahead.
Kline, with your just comment, what's the best way to convince the elected officials to cut spending?
Vote them out of office.
Thank you, Dr. Folsom, for your great lecture. I just wanted to know, it's a little off the FDR topic, but do you know which of the Federalist or Anti-Federalist papers kind of can coincide with the First Amendment? And is there a good guide to Federalist papers to constitutional parts?
Yes, there is, and I can't give you a precise correlation there. You know, like Federalist 21 correlates heavily with taxes. You know, and of course, Federalist 51 and Federalist 10 are so good with Republican government factions. And that is in part free speech. Federalist 10 is good for free speech because what it says is that the recipe against bad ideas is to just let them compete with other ideas. In other words, let free speech prevail. Madison writes. And good ideas in the long run will prevail over bad ideas. And I want to give this to Madison. He not only wrote Federalist 10, which he was expressing that idea on free speech, but when he was president, it was during a war. And he had the chance to shut newspapers down and shut meetings down, and he didn't do any of it. And he didn't even raise taxes in the war because he said if you raise taxes during the war, the tax may remain there after the war. How many would like to write James Madison in on the ballot? And I've got some other news. He did that, and then he said, let's enact a somewhat higher tariff, because a tariff is easier to adjust than a tax, which you never get rid of. We put in a high tariff somewhat to pay for the war, and we ended up paying for the whole war. Now imagine this, we fought a war, we paid for the whole war, and paid off the entire federal debt. Within 20 years after Madison did that, we were a nation of surplus. We had zero national debt, we had surplus. In fact, when states came into the Union, they got free money for being a state. We handed every state money back at the end of the year because we had no debt, we had surplus. Now that's my kind of president. Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think, since you were talking about Roosevelt and Social Security, and I wasn't even born in Roosevelt, and I'm not getting Social Security, a lot of these people are, but what do you think the young people should do with Social Security? What do you think nobody wants to talk about?
It is interesting. In Hillsdale, most of my students...
Savings accounts, young people should...
Yeah, we should have some kind of private savings accounts. At least give them a chance to put some of that money, and President Bush had this suggestion, at least to put a chunk of it in some kind of savings account. I'm sure you've all heard the polls where most young people, a greater percentage believe in UFOs than believe that they will be around to collect their Social Security. And that's kind of a tragic situation. But I've asked my students, what would you like to do, at age 20? And of course, most of them say, well, I think I'm independent, I ought to not even have it. And I said, well, in this day and age, it's hard to do. Politically, that may not be feasible. And they say, well, then private accounts. Some kind of private accounts where we can invest some of the money at least, and then have that instead of the fixed amount that the government gives us. Yeah.
We are in a global economy, which means there's pressure for global government to regulate the global economy. How do we maintain our independence in the face of this new era of commerce?
Yeah, the question is that we're in a global economy, and the thing is, the United States, here's the thing that's kind of interesting, we've done best when we've been in a super global economy. And of course we were right from the start. We were trading with Britain, ships, and we were trading back and forth with Europe. And so to some extent we've been that way right from the start, but the more that we have been traded globally and competed globally, the more we have discovered that we're such an inventive nation. We're such an inventive nation that we'll invent things and we'll develop them better than most other countries, so that we have more stuff to trade historically over the years than other countries have. When we provide a free economy, we compete very favorably in a global economy. Furthermore, we get cheap goods that other people are able to make better than we can do. So it works out well on both sides. The secret is avoiding what we had during the Great Depression with that incredibly high tariff. And getting out of that, the politics of the tariff are very tricky sometimes to work around. But the freer sometimes that we've been able to make our economy, often it has served the nation as a whole, even though particular groups have sometimes not benefited. It's tended to serve the nation as a whole very well.
Burt, Folsom, PhD, distinguished guest speaker, and for dedicated service to the principles of American liberty and the conservative formula. For those of you who are first-time guests, we have